John Harper wiped the sweat from his brow as he trudged across the barren, rocky surface of the moon. The air was thin here, barely breathable even with his oxygen mask, and the ground beneath his boots crunched with every step. He had been scavenging, for weeks now, searching for anything valuable enough to sell back on Earth. His ship, a beat-up old vessel named the Wanderer, sat parked in the distance, its hull dented and scratched from years of rough landings and hasty repairs. John wasn't rich, but he didn't need to be. All he wanted was enough credits to keep flying, to stay free. The sun, or rather the dying star this moon orbited, was low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the desolate landscape. It was getting colder, and John knew he should head back soon. But something caught his eye, a faint glimmer of light reflecting off a cluster of rocks up ahead. Curiosity got the better of him, and he adjusted the strap of his backpack before walking toward it. As he approached, the glimmer turned out to be nothing more than shards of crystalline material embedded in the rock. Disappointed, John sighed and turned to leave when he heard it, a soft sound almost like a whimper. He froze, listening intently. There it was again, closer this time. It sounded alive. Cautiously, John moved around the rocks, peering into the narrow crevice between them. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Huddled together in the shadowy space were three small creatures, no bigger than house cats. Their skin shimmered faintly, translucent and glowing with an inner light that seemed almost magical. Large, round eyes blinked up at him, filled with fear and confusion. They looked fragile, delicate, like they might break if touched too roughly. John crouched down, holding his hands up to show he meant no harm. "Hey there," he said softly, though he doubted they understood him. One of the creatures tilted its head, watching him curiously. Another let out a tiny chirp, the sound echoing strangely in the stillness of the moon. For a moment, John considered leaving them alone. After all, he was just a scavenger, not some kind of hero. These weren't his problems. But then he noticed the claw marks etched deeply into the rocks nearby, fresh ones. Whatever had made those marks was big and dangerous. And judging by the way the little creatures flinched at every distant noise, they were terrified. John frowned. He couldn't just walk away. Not after seeing that. He reached into his pack and pulled out a protein bar, unwrapping it slowly so as not to startle them. Breaking off a piece, he held it out toward the nearest creature. At first it hesitated, its wide eyes darting between the food and John's face. Then, tentatively, it reached out with one slender limb and took the offering. The other two watched, closely, their movements cautious but curious. "Well, I guess we're doing this now," John muttered to himself, breaking off another piece of the bar. He wasn't sure what he was going to do next, but one thing was certain. He couldn't leave these things here to fend for themselves, not with predators lurking nearby. As the sun dipped lower, casting the moon into twilight, John gathered the creatures into a makeshift carrier he fashioned from his jacket. They didn't resist, seemingly trusting him despite their earlier fear. He couldn't blame them. They were probably starving, exhausted, and desperate for any kind of protection. Still, he felt a pang of guilt. He wasn't equipped to take care of alien life forms. Hell, he could barely take care of himself most days. But as he carried them back toward the Wanderer, one of the creatures nuzzled against his arm, making a soft, cooing sound. John glanced down at it, surprised by how warm it felt against his skin. For the first time in a long while, he felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. By the time he reached the ship, the temperature had dropped significantly, and frost coated the metal exterior of the Wanderer. John hurried inside, setting the carrier down gently on the floor of the cramped cockpit. The creatures immediately huddled together again, their glowing forms casting eerie shadows on the walls. John rummaged through his supplies, pulling out a thermos of water and a few more snacks. He didn't know if they could eat human food, but it was worth a try. While they nibbled cautiously at the offerings, John powered up the ship's systems and began scanning the surrounding area. Sure enough, the sensors picked up movement, large, fast-moving shapes circling the perimeter. Whatever was out there was closing in, and it wouldn't be long before it found them. John leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his hair. This was insane. He was a scavenger, not a guardian angel. Protecting these creatures went against everything he stood for, everything he had trained himself to avoid. Survival meant looking out for number one, not risking your neck for strangers, especially ones who couldn't even speak your language. And yet, he looked over at the creatures, watching as they shared the last bits of the protein bar. They reminded him of children, innocent and vulnerable, completely unaware of the dangers lurking outside. If he left them here, they wouldn't stand a chance. But if he stayed, he'd be putting himself directly in harm's way. John sighed, rubbing his temples. He didn't have much choice, did he? Whether he liked it or not, he was already involved. Leaving now would mean abandoning them to die. And he wasn't that kind of man. Not anymore. All right, he said aloud, more to himself than to the creatures. Let's figure this out. He spent the next hour fortifying the ship, sealing off any gaps where predators might try to break in. Then he armed himself with whatever weapons he could scrounge up. An old laser pistol, a knife, and a few homemade explosives he kept for emergencies. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. John tensed, gripping the laser pistol tightly as he peered out the window. Shadows moved across the rocky terrain, dark shapes illuminated briefly by flashes of lightning in the distance. The predators were here. One of the creatures whimpered, behind him, and John turned to see them huddled together once more, their glowing bodies dimming slightly as if sensing the danger. He knelt beside them, placing a reassuring hand on the closest one. "It's gonna be okay," he whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. "I've got you." The first attack came without warning. A massive creature slammed into the side of the ship, shaking it violently. Its body was covered in thick chitinous armor, and its mandibles clicked menacing-handedly as it tried to force its way inside. John fired the laser pistol through the window, hitting the creature squarely in the chest. It roared in pain, retreating momentarily before charging again. More shapes appeared in the darkness, converging on the ship like a swarm of locusts. John realized quickly that he was outnumbered and outmatched. But retreat wasn't an option, not while the creatures depended on him. Gritting his teeth, John prepared for the fight of his life. The first wave of attackers was relentless. John Harper fired his laser pistol until the charge ran dangerously low, each shot striking true but barely slowing the massive creatures down. They were unlike anything he'd ever seen before. Towering, insectoid beasts with jagged exoskeletons that glinted under the dim light of the dying star. Their mandibles snapped hungrily as they clawed at the ship, trying to tear through the metal hull. Inside, the alien cubs huddled together in the corner of the cockpit, their glowing forms flickering nervously as the ship shook with every impact. One of them let out a soft chirp, its tiny body trembling. John glanced over his shoulder at them, his heart pounding. He couldn't afford to lose focus, not even for a second, but seeing their fear made him feel something he hadn't felt in years: responsibility. He reloaded the laser pistol quickly, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. The largest predator slammed into the side of the ship again, denting the already battered exterior. Sparks flew from the control panel as wires shorted out, and John cursed under his breath. If they broke through, it would be over. He didn't have enough firepower to take on all of them at once. Thinking fast, John grabbed one of the homemade explosives he'd prepared earlier. It wasn't much, just a small device rigged with scrap metal and volatile chemicals, but it might buy him some time. He pressed a button to activate the timer, then hurled it through the shattered window toward the nearest attacker. The explosion sent shards of rock flying, momentarily scattering the creatures outside. For a few precious seconds, there was silence. John used the brake to assess the situation. The ship's defenses were failing, and he knew he couldn't hold out forever. He needed a plan, a way to keep the predators at bay long enough to regroup. His eyes fell on the pile of tools and spare parts scattered across the floor. Inspiration struck. Using whatever materials he could find, John began constructing crude traps. He set up tripwires near the entrance, attaching them to cans filled with sharp metal fragments. He positioned makeshift spears made from broken pieces of machinery along the edges of the ship, angling them outward to impale anything that tried to climb aboard. It wasn't elegant, but it was all he had. As he worked, one of the cubs crept closer to him, its large eyes watching his every move. John paused for a moment, meeting its gaze. "Stay back," he said gently, though he doubted it understood. The cub tilted its head, studying him curiously before retreating to join the others. John shook his head, muttering to himself, "You're getting attached, Harper. That's not good." The respite didn't last long. The predators returned, more aggressive than before. This time they came in greater numbers, surrounding the ship completely. John watched through the cracked windshield as their glowing eyes reflected the moonlight, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. He tightened his grip on the laser pistol, knowing this was going to be the hardest fight yet. The first beast tripped one of the traps, sending a spray of shrapnel into its armored body. It screeched in pain, thrashing wildly and drawing the attention of the others. John seized the opportunity, firing repeatedly at the wounded creature while it distracted the rest of the pack. Another trap went off, this time catching two of the predators in its deadly embrace. The explosions lit up the night, illuminating the battlefield in flashes of fiery orange. But the Vraxians, as John had mentally dubbed them, were smart. They adapted quickly, avoiding the traps and converging on the weakest points of the ship. One managed to pry open a section of the hull, forcing its way inside. John reacted instantly, grabbing his knife and lunging at the intruder. The blade bounced harmlessly off its thick exoskeleton, but the sudden movement startled the creature enough for John to drive it back outside with a well-placed kick. Breathing heavily, John leaned against the wall, his muscles burning from exertion. He was running out of options and time. The ship wouldn't hold much longer, and neither would he. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, a voice called out from behind him. "Need a hand?" John spun around, startled. Standing in the yaw doorway was Emily Blake, a scavenger he'd met briefly during a supply run months ago. She was shorter than him, with curly brown hair tied back in a messy ponytail and dirt smudged across her face. In her hands, she held a plasma rifle that looked far more advanced than anything John owned. "What are you doing here?" John demanded, lowering his weapon slightly. "I followed the commotion," Emily replied with a shrug, stepping further, into the cockpit. Her eyes widened as she noticed the glowing cubs huddled in the corner. "And I see you've picked up some interesting passengers." "No time for explanations," John snapped, turning back to the window. Outside, the remaining predators were regrouping, preparing for another assault. "We need to get rid of those things before they tear this place apart." Emily nodded, raising her rifle. "Got it. Let's show these bugs what happens when they mess with humans." Working together, the two scavengers formed a formidable team. Emily took position by the window, picking off the predators with precision shots from her plasma rifle. Meanwhile, John focused on reinforcing the ship's defenses, using the brief lull in attacks to patch up the damaged sections of the hull. The cubs stayed close to him, their presence oddly comforting despite the chaos unfolding around them. One particularly bold Vraxian leapt onto the roof of the ship, attempting to break through from above. Emily adjusted her aim and fired, hitting the creature square in the chest. It fell with a deafening crash, landing just inches away from the cockpit. John winced, realizing how close they had come to disaster. "They're persistent, I'll give them that," Emily remarked, reloading her rifle. "Any idea why they're so interested in your little friends here?" John shook his head. "No clue. But they're not leaving until we make them." As dawn approached, the final wave of attackers descended upon the ship. Exhausted and bruised, John and Emily fought side by side, their movements synchronized as if they had been doing this for years. The cubs watched silently, their glowing bodies casting faint shadows on the walls as the battle raged on. Finally, after what felt like hours, the last Vraxian retreated, disappearing into the horizon as the first rays of sunlight touched the moon's surface. The silence that followed was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of John and Emily's labored breathing. "Well," Emily said, lowering her rifle with a grin. "That was fun." John couldn't help but chuckle, though it came out more like a wheeze. "Fun? You're crazy." She shrugged, slinging the rifle over her shoulder. "Maybe, but hey, at least we're still alive." John glanced over at the cubs who were now cautiously exploring the cockpit again. One of them chirped softly, its tiny body brushing against his leg. For the first time in a long while, John felt a sense of peace amidst the wreckage. They had survived the night, and somehow he knew this was only the beginning. The sun rose slowly over the moon's jagged horizon, painting the rocky landscape in shades of orange and red. John Harper sat slumped against the wall of the cockpit, his body aching from the night's battle. Emily Blake was busy inspecting the damage to the ship, her hands moving quickly as she patched up holes and reinforced weakened sections. The cubs were curled up together in the corner, their glowing forms dimmed now that the immediate danger had passed. They seemed calm, almost peaceful, but John knew better than to let his guard down. "We're not safe here," Emily said, breaking the silence. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand and glanced at John. "Those things, we'll be back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll come again." John nodded, rubbing his temples. He hadn't slept in over 24 hours, and exhaustion was starting to catch up with him. "I know," he muttered. "But where do we go? My ship can't fly like this, and yours?" "Mine's a wreck too," Emily admitted, sitting down beside him. "I crash-landed a few miles away when my engine gave out. That's why I'm stuck on this rock." John sighed, staring at the cracked windshield. Outside, the remnants of the battle lay scattered across the ground, shards of metal, scorched rocks, and the lifeless bodies of several Vraxians. It was a grim reminder of how close they'd come to disaster. But even worse was the knowledge that they couldn't stay here forever. The moon offered no shelter, no resources, and no way to protect the cubs indefinitely. "We need to find somewhere safer," John said finally. "A cave, maybe. Somewhere defensible." Emily raised an eyebrow. "You think there are caves around here?" "There have to be," John replied. "This place has been geologically active for who knows how long. If we can find one, we might stand a chance." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all they had. After a quick rest, John and Emily gathered what supplies they could salvage from the ship and set out on foot, carrying the cubs in makeshift carriers fashioned from scraps of fabric. The journey was slow and grueling. The terrain was rough, and the thin atmosphere made every step feel heavier than it should. Still, they pressed on, driven by the hope of finding refuge before the Vraxians returned. As they walked, John noticed something peculiar about the cubs. They seemed to communicate with each other, not through words but through soft chirps and subtle movements. At times they would glance at John or Emily, their large eyes filled with what looked like gratitude. One cub in particular, which John had started calling Luma, stayed close to him, occasionally brushing its small body against his leg. It was strange, almost unnerving, but also comforting in a way he couldn't explain. After hours of searching, they finally found what they were looking for, a narrow opening in the side of a cliff that led into a dark, cavernous space. The entrance was partially hidden by fallen rocks, making it difficult to spot from a distance. Inside, the air was cooler, and the walls glittered faintly with veins of crystalline material. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than being out in the open. "This will work," Emily said, setting down her pack. "We can fortify the entrance and set up some traps. With any luck, those bugs won't find us so easily." John nodded, already mentally mapping out the space. There were several tunnels branching off from the main chamber, providing plenty of room to hide if needed. He handed Emily a flashlight and began exploring deeper into the cave, checking for signs of other inhabitants. To his relief, the place appeared empty, save for a few harmless insects scurrying along the walls. While Emily worked on reinforcing the entrance, John focused on teaching the cubs how to navigate the cave safely. He showed them where to hide, if danger approached, and encouraged them to stay close to him at all times. Surprisingly, they seemed to understand, following his instructions without hesitation. It was as if they trusted him completely, a thought that both humbled and terrified him. That night, as they rested in the relative safety of the cave, John found himself thinking about Emily. She had saved his life, and the lives of the cubs, back at the ship, and he owed her more than he could ever repay. But there was something else about her that intrigued him. Unlike most scavengers who were content to live solitary lives, Emily seemed genuinely interested in helping others. Her willingness to risk everything for strangers spoke volumes about her character. "You didn't have to stay," John said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Emily looked up from the fire she had built, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. "What do you mean?" she asked. "You could have left after the fight," John explained. "Gone back to your own ship, tried to fix it. Instead, you stayed to help me and them." He gestured toward the cubs who were sleeping peacefully nearby. Emily shrugged, poking at the fire with a stick. "Maybe I just wanted to see how this story ends," she said lightly. But there was a seriousness in her voice that suggested she meant more than she was letting on. John smiled faintly, leaning back against the cave wall. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to relax, even if only for a moment. The cubs were safe for now, and he had someone he could count on. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The next morning, they woke to the sound of distant screeches, echoing through the cave. John and Emily exchanged worried glances, grabbing their weapons and rushing to the entrance. Outside, the Vraxians were gathering once again, their glowing eyes visible in the early morning light. This time, however, they weren't alone. Larger, more menacing creatures accompanied them, their armored bodies glistening menacingly in the sunlight. "They brought reinforcements," Emily whispered, her grip tightening on her plasma rifle. John clenched his jaw, determination hardening his features. "Then we'll just have to be smarter." Together, they prepared for another fight, knowing full well that this might be their last stand. But as John looked down at Luma, who was watching him with wide, trusting eyes, he felt a surge of resolve. No matter what happened, he wouldn't let these creatures down, not while he still had breath in his body. And so, with the odds stacked against them, John and Emily stood ready to face whatever came next. The Vraxians moved closer, their massive forms casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. John Harper tightened his grip on the laser pistol, his knuckles white from the strain. Beside him, Emily Blake adjusted her stance, her plasma rifle aimed steadily at the approaching horde. The air was tense, heavy with anticipation, as if the entire moon was holding its breath. "They're smarter this time," Emily muttered, her voice barely audible over the clicking of mandibles and the scrape of claws against stone. "Look at how they're spreading out," John nodded grimly. He had noticed it too. The predators weren't charging blindly like before. Instead, they were forming a loose circle around the cave entrance, cutting off any chance of escape. It was clear that they intended to wear the humans down, forcing them into a corner until they made a mistake. Inside the cave, the cubs huddled together, their glowing bodies flickering nervously. One of them let out a soft chirp, but it was quickly silenced by Luma, who nudged the others into silence. John glanced back at them briefly, his heart aching at the sight of their fear. He couldn't let them down. Not now. Not ever. "We need to hold them off," John said, his voice low but firm. "If we can keep them away from the entrance, we might have a chance." "And then what?" Emily asked, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Even if we survive this attack, we're still trapped here. We can't stay in this cave forever." John didn't have an answer for that. For now, survival was all that mattered. He turned his attention back to the predators, focusing on the largest one, a towering beast with jagged spines running down its back. If they could take it down, the others might retreat, at least temporarily. "Let's start with the big one," John said, pointing toward the leader. "If we can hit it hard enough, the rest might scatter." Emily nodded, raising her rifle. "On 3? 1, 2, 3. They fired simultaneously, their shots striking the creature in unison. The impact sent it stumbling backward, screeching in pain as its armored exoskeleton cracked under the force of the blasts. But instead of retreating, the other Vraxians surged forward, closing the gap between them and the cave. John cursed under, his breath firing rapidly as the creatures advanced. Each shot found its mark, but there were too many of them. Just when it seemed like they were about to be overwhelmed, Emily shouted, "Fall back! Into the cave!" John hesitated for a split second, unwilling to leave the open ground undefended. But he knew she was right. They couldn't risk being surrounded. Together they retreated into the cave, taking up positions near the entrance. The narrow passage would make it harder for the Vraxians to attack in numbers, giving them a slight advantage. As the first wave of predators reached the cave, John triggered the traps they had set earlier. Explosions rocked the entrance, sending shards of rock and metal flying in every direction. Several Vraxians fell, their bodies mangled by the makeshift weapons. But the others pressed on, undeterred by the losses. "This isn't going to last long," Emily said, reloading her rifle. Her hands were steady, but her voice betrayed a hint of desperation. "We need another plan." John's mind raced as he fired again, searching for anything that might give them the upper hand. Then he remembered something, the crystals embedded in the cave walls. Earlier he had noticed how they shimmered faintly, almost like they were charged with energy. If they could harness that power somehow, they might be able to turn the tide of the battle. "Emily," John called out, ducking behind a boulder as a Vraxian claw scraped dangerously close to his head. "Those crystals. Do you think your rifle can overload them?" Emily frowned, glancing at the glittering veins running along the walls. "Maybe, but if I miss, we'll blow ourselves up along with them." "It's worth the risk," John replied. "Trust me." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, cover me while I set it up." John stepped forward, firing wildly to draw the attention of the nearest Vraxians. Their snapping jaws and thrashing limbs came dangerously close, but he held his ground, determined to give Emily the time she needed. Behind him, he heard the hum of her plasma rifle as she adjusted the settings, aiming carefully at the largest cluster of crystals. "Ready!" Emily shouted. "Do it!" John yelled back, diving out of the way just as she pulled the trigger. The beam of energy struck the crystals with pinpoint accuracy, igniting a chain reaction that lit up the entire cave. A deafening roar filled the air as the walls began to collapse, sealing off the entrance and trapping the remaining Vraxians outside. Dust and debris rained down, forcing John and Emily to shield themselves from the falling rocks. When the chaos finally subsided, the cave was eerily quiet. John coughed, brushing dirt from his face as he looked around. The entrance was completely blocked, leaving only a dim glow from the crystals to illuminate the space. The cubs were huddled together in the far corner, their wide eyes reflecting the faint light. "Is everyone okay?" John asked, his voice hoarse. "I'm fine," Emily replied, though her hands were trembling slightly. "But we're stuck here now. No way out." John sighed, leaning against the wall. Exhaustion weighed heavily on him, but he forced himself to stay alert. They had survived, for now, but their situation was far from ideal. Without a way to leave the cave, they were essentially trapped, dependent on whatever resources they had managed to bring with them. As the hours passed, John and Emily worked together to secure the cave, reinforcing the unstable sections of the ceiling and setting up basic living quarters. The cubs seemed to sense their determination, mimicking their movements and helping in small ways. Luma, in particular, stayed glued to John's side, occasionally nuzzling his hand as if to offer comfort. Despite the dire circumstances, John felt a strange sense of camaraderie growing between them. Emily proved to be resourceful and quick-thinking, always finding solutions to problems before they became insurmountable. And the cubs, though fragile and alien, brought a warmth to the cold, dark cave that neither human could have anticipated. But even as they settled into their new routine, John couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Supplies were limited, and the Vraxians were still out there waiting for their next opportunity to strike. More than anything, he wanted to find a way to get the cubs, and himself, off this moon. He owed them that much. One evening, as they sat by the firelight created from burning scraps of wood salvaged from the ship, Emily spoke up. "You know, people are probably talking about us by now." John raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "The fight at your ship, the explosions, the collapsing cave, it's not exactly subtle," she explained. "Someone must have noticed. Maybe even sent word to nearby colonies or ships." John frowned, considering the possibility. "If that's true, help could be on the way, but we can't count on it. We need to figure out our own way out of this." Emily nodded, staring into the flames. "Agreed, but still. It's nice to think about, isn't it? That somewhere out there people might see what you're doing and call you a hero." John chuckled bitterly. "I'm no hero, Emily. I'm just a scavenger trying to survive." "Surviving doesn't mean you can't be brave," she countered softly. "And trust me, John, you're braver than most." Her words lingered in the air, settling over him like a weight. He didn't feel brave. He felt tired, scared, and uncertain about what lay ahead. But deep down, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't giving up. Not while the cubs still depended on him. And so, with the echoes of battle fading into memory and the promise of hope lingering on the horizon, John Harper prepared to face whatever challenges awaited them next. Days turned into weeks inside the cave, and life took on a strange rhythm. John Harper and Emily Blake worked tirelessly to keep themselves and the cubs alive. They rationed their food carefully, stretching each meal as far as possible. The crystals in the walls provided some light, though it was dim and flickering, casting long shadows that danced across the rocky surfaces. Despite the gloom, the cubs seemed to adapt well, their glowing forms offering a small measure of comfort in the darkness. John spent most of his time reinforcing the cave's defenses or teaching the cubs how to navigate the tunnels safely. Luma, in particular, had become inseparable from him. She followed him everywhere, her chirps and soft coos serving as a constant reminder of why he was fighting so hard. Emily, meanwhile, focused on repairing what little equipment they had salvaged from the ship. Her hands were steady and skilled, and she managed to cobble together a functioning communication device using scraps of metal and wires. "We need to send out a signal," Emily said one day, holding up the makeshift device. "If there are ships nearby, this might give us a chance." John nodded, though he wasn't optimistic. "It's worth a shot, but we can't rely on anyone coming to save us. We still need a backup plan." "Agreed," Emily replied. "But sitting here waiting for the Vraxians to dig through that rubble isn't exactly a strategy either." They activated the device, sending out a repeating distress call in multiple frequencies. The machine hummed softly, its faint beeping echoing through the cave. It was a small hope, but it was something. For the first time in days, John allowed himself to imagine rescue, a ship appearing on the horizon, taking them away from this desolate moon. But reality soon reminded him that survival wasn't that simple. Supplies dwindled faster than expected, and the temperature inside the cave began to drop as the dying star above cast weaker and weaker light. The cubs, who required specific environmental conditions to thrive, started showing signs of stress. Their glow dimmed, and their movements became sluggish. John knew they couldn't stay much longer. "We need to find their homeworld," John said one evening, breaking the silence. He sat cross-legged on the ground, staring at the map displayed on Emily's tablet. She had pieced together fragments of data recovered from an old alien probe, identifying a distant planet teeming with life. "This has to be where they came from. If we can get there, they'll have a better chance." Emily looked skeptical. "Even if we manage to fix your ship enough to fly, do you really think we can make it that far? That planet is light years away." "It's our only option," John insisted. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "We can't stay here, and we can't leave them behind." Emily sighed, running a hand through her curly hair. "All right, let's try. But if this doesn't work—" "It will," John interrupted. "It has to." The next few days were spent preparing for the journey. John scavenged what he could from the wreckage of the Wanderer, patching up the hull and rerouting power to critical systems. Emily helped wherever she could, keeping watch over the cubs while John worked. The creatures seemed to sense the urgency, staying close and occasionally helping by carrying small tools or parts in their tiny limbs. Finally, after endless hours of labor, the ship was ready, or as ready as it would ever be. John loaded the cubs into carriers, securing them safely in the cockpit. Emily climbed aboard reluctantly, knowing full well that the odds of success were slim. As the engines roared to life, John felt a surge of determination. This was it. One last gamble to save not just himself, but the fragile lives depending on him. The flight was anything but smooth. The ship groaned and shuddered under the strain, its damaged system struggling to keep up with the demands of interstellar travel. Outside, the void of space stretched endlessly, vast and indifferent. Inside, tension hung thick in the air. John monitored the controls closely, adjusting course whenever necessary to avoid asteroid fields and other hazards. At one point, disaster nearly struck when a rogue asteroid clipped the ship's wing, sending sparks flying and alarms blaring. Emily sprang into action, grabbing a fire extinguisher and putting out the flames before they could spread. Meanwhile, John wrestled with the controls, stabilizing the vessel just in time to avoid a collision with another rock. "They're amazing," Emily said suddenly, breaking the tense silence. She was watching the cubs, who had remained calm throughout the chaos. How do they know what to do? John glanced back at them, noticing how they seemed to instinctively mimic his movements, helping stabilize themselves during turbulence. "I don't know," he admitted. "But they've saved us more times than I can count." As the days passed, the ship limped closer to its destination. The coordinates led them to a breathtaking world filled with towering crystalline structures and lush vegetation. Rivers of liquid light flowed through valleys, and the air shimmered with colors John had never seen before. It was unlike anything he could have imagined, a paradise compared to the barren moon they had left behind. When they finally landed, the cubs became visibly excited, chirping loudly and pressing against the edges of their carriers. John opened the hatch cautiously, stepping onto the soft, glowing ground. A group of aliens emerged from the trees, their forms tall and elegant, with skin that sparkled like starlight. They spoke in melodic tones, their voices harmonizing in a way that seemed almost musical. One of them approached John, bowing slightly as a gesture of respect. Through gestures and broken attempts at communication, John explained what had happened: the Vraxians, the cave, the journey across space. The Xenari, as they called themselves, listened intently, their expressions shifting between sorrow and gratitude. "You have done a great thing," one of the Xenari said, speaking haltingly in a language John barely understood. "These young ones, they are precious to us." John nodded, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "Take care of them," he said simply, though he doubted they fully understood. "They deserve a better life than what we gave them." The Xenari accepted the cubs gently, cradling them in their arms as if they were made of glass. Luma hesitated for a moment, looking back at John with wide, trusting eyes. Then, with a final chirp, she joined the others, disappearing into the crowd of shimmering figures. John watched until they were out of sight, his chest tight with emotion. Emily placed a hand on his shoulder, offering silent support. "You did good, John," she said softly. "Better than anyone could have asked." He didn't respond. Instead, he turned back toward the ship, knowing it was time to leave. The atmosphere of the planet was incompatible with human biology, and staying too long would risk his health, and possibly his life. But as he climbed aboard the Wanderer for the final time, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had done what he set out to do. He had protected the innocent even when it meant risking everything. As the ship lifted off, John glanced out the window one last time. Below, the Xenari stood gathered, watching silently as the humans departed. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he saw Luma's glow among the crowd, brighter than ever. And in that moment, he knew he had made the right choice. The journey back to Earth would be long and uncertain, but John didn't mind. For the first time in years, he had a purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. And though the galaxy was vast and often cruel, he carried with him the memory of those glowing cubs and the bond they had shared. It was enough to remind him that even in the darkest corners of space there was still light. John Harper leaned back in the pilot's seat of the Wanderer, his eyes fixed on the endless expanse of stars outside the cracked windshield. The ship groaned softly as it limped through space, its battered frame barely holding together after the long journey. Emily sat beside him, her gaze distant as she stared out at the void. Neither of them spoke much anymore. There wasn't much left to say. They had done what they set out to do, saved the cubs and delivered them safely to their homeworld. But now, as they drifted toward Earth, the weight of everything they had been through began to settle over them. "You think anyone will believe us?" Emily asked finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure she wanted an answer. John shrugged, his hands resting lightly on the controls. "Doesn't matter if they do," he replied. "We know what happened, that's enough." Emily nodded slowly, but her expression remained thoughtful. "Still, it feels like something worth sharing. People should know about those cubs, about what you did for them." John chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. "I didn't do it for recognition, Emily. I did it because it was the right thing to do." "I know," she said quickly, turning to face him. "But sometimes doing the right thing changes more than just your own life. It inspires others, makes them think maybe they can make a difference too." John didn't respond. He didn't want to argue with her, but he also didn't see himself as some kind of hero. He was just a scavenger, a man who had stumbled into a situation far bigger than himself and somehow managed to survive. If people called him brave, it wouldn't change the fact that he'd acted out of necessity, not altruism. Still, he couldn't deny that Emily had a point. Stories had power even if they weren't entirely true. As they neared Earth's orbit, John noticed something unusual on the radar, a faint signal coming from one of the nearby stations. At first he thought it might be interference or a glitch, but the signal grew stronger as they approached. It was a message, repeating endlessly in multiple languages. "Attention all vessels," the robotic voice announced. "Please stand by for priority transmission." John exchanged a glance with Emily. Priority transmissions were rare, reserved only for emergencies or significant events. Curious, they tuned in, watching as a holographic image flickered to life on the console. "This is Captain Rachel Hayes of the Galactic Council," the figure began, her tone formal yet warm. "We are issuing a galaxy-wide bulletin regarding recent reports of extraordinary acts of courage and compassion. Specifically, we seek information on a human individual known only as the Protector." John froze, his heart skipping a beat. Beside him, Emily let out a sharp laugh. "Well, that's subtle." The transmission continued, describing how travelers and traders across the galaxy had begun sharing tales of a lone human who had defended alien cubs from deadly predators. Some claimed he fought with advanced weaponry. Others swore he used nothing but his bare hands. The details varied wildly, but the core of the story remained the same. A human had risked his life to save creatures not of his own kind, earning the gratitude of an entire species. "They're talking about you," Emily said, grinning despite herself. "You're famous." John shook his head, trying to process what he was hearing. "No, they're talking about some exaggerated version of me. I didn't fight those things with my bare hands." "Close enough," Emily teased, nudging him playfully. "Besides, legends always grow in the retelling. Doesn't mean it's not based on truth." John sighed, leaning forward to shut off the transmission. As much as he appreciated the sentiment, he didn't want to dwell on it. Fame or infamy wasn't why he had done what he did. All he cared about was knowing the cubs were safe. When they finally landed on Earth, the atmosphere felt strange, after so long in space. The air was thick and humid, carrying the scent of rain-soaked soil and distant wildfires. John stepped off the ship, his boots crunching against the gravel runway of a small docking station. Emily followed close behind, carrying the last of their supplies. They parted ways shortly afterward, each heading in different directions. Emily planned to return to her old life, though John suspected she wouldn't stay grounded for long. She was too restless, too driven to sit still for any length of time. For his part, John wandered aimlessly for days, unable to shake the feeling that something was missing. He visited bars and diners, listening to snippets of conversation wherever he went. To his surprise, the stories of the Protector had already reached Earth. Miners, traders, and even dock workers swapped tales of the mysterious human who had stood against insurmountable odds. Some dismissed the accounts as exaggerations, while others spoke of them with reverence as if recounting ancient myths. One night, sitting alone in a dimly lit tavern, John overheard two men arguing about the legend. One insisted the Protector was real, citing eyewitness accounts from passing freighters. The other laughed it off, calling it nothing more than a tall tale designed to sell drinks. "It doesn't matter if it's true," the skeptic said, raising his glass. "What matters is that it gives people hope. In a universe this big, cold, and cruel, it's nice to think there are still good people out there." John smiled faintly, finishing his drink before slipping out into the night. Hope. That was something he could get behind. In the weeks that followed, John found himself drawn back to the stars. He repaired the Wanderer once again, patching up the holes and tuning the engines until they hummed with renewed energy. This time, he didn't have a specific destination in mind. He simply wanted to explore, to see what else the galaxy had to offer. Before leaving, he carved Emily's name into the hull of the ship, just below the cockpit window. It was a small gesture, but it meant something to him. She had saved his life, and in doing so, she had reminded him of the importance of connection, even in the vast emptiness of space. As the Wanderer lifted off, John glanced back at Earth one last time. The blue-green orb shrank rapidly in the distance, replaced by the infinite blackness of space. Somewhere out there, the Zenari were thriving, their young ones growing strong under the care of their elders. And somewhere among them, Luma's glow would shine brightly, a reminder of the bond they had shared. John didn't need fame or fortune. He didn't need songs sung in his honor or statues erected in his name. What he needed was purpose. And he had found it in the most unexpected place. By protecting the innocent, he had discovered what it truly meant to be human. And so, John Harper disappeared into the stars, a quiet figure drifting through the cosmos. His legend lived on, passed down from generation to generation, inspiring countless others to act with courage and compassion. Whether the stories were true or embellished no longer mattered. What mattered was the hope they carried, the belief that even in the darkest corners of the universe, light could still prevail. For John, that was enough.